The birthday preparations had been in motion for months. As a hard-working single mom juggling two jobs, one as a nurse's assistant during the day and another as a part-time bookkeeper in the evenings, Mrs. Jackson had been carefully setting aside money since January. Every extra dollar from her overtime shifts went straight into a special envelope labeled Birthday Fund that she kept tucked away in her dresser drawer. Her son was turning 10, and this birthday needed to be special. They'd moved to the suburbs 6 months ago after she'd finally saved enough for a down payment on a small house. The move meant better schools and a safer neighborhood, but it also meant being one of the few black families in an area that wasn't exactly known for its diversity. The transition hadn't been easy for either of them. At first, her son struggled to make friends in his new school. He missed his old neighborhood, where kids would play basketball in the street until sunset and everyone knew each other by name. Here, the streets were quieter, and the neighbors kept to themselves, offering polite but distant smiles during chance encounters at the mailbox or while taking out the trash. But things started looking up when he joined the school's science club. His natural talent for experiments and endless curiosity about how things worked helped him connect with his classmates. Soon, he was coming home with stories about lab projects and his new friends' funny mishaps with the microscopes. When he shyly asked if he could have a real birthday party this year, not just cake and ice cream with his mom and grandma, Mrs. Jackson knew she had to make it happen. She worked extra weekend shifts, cut back on her own expenses, and even learned to do basic car maintenance from YouTube videos instead of going to the mechanic. The planning became her evening project. After putting her son to bed, she'd sit at the kitchen table with a notepad, researching party rental companies and comparing prices for bounce houses. She found a local company that offered a special discount for booking during off-peak hours, and the owner was touched by her dedication when she explained her situation during the booking call. The menu planning required special attention. Her son had friends with various dietary restrictions. One couldn't eat gluten, another was vegetarian. She spent hours looking up recipes that would make sure every child could enjoy the treats without feeling left out. She decided on a mix of traditional party favorites and some healthier options that the parents would appreciate. The morning of the party arrived with perfect weather, sunny skies with just enough clouds to keep the temperature comfortable. Mrs. Jackson was up before dawn, her heart racing with a mixture of excitement and nerves. She kept checking her phone, worried she'd get last-minute cancellations, but instead found sweet messages from parents confirming their kids' attendance. Her son woke up earlier than usual, practically bouncing off the walls with excitement. "Mom, Mom, is it time yet?" He called out, running into the kitchen still in his space-themed pajamas. She couldn't help but laugh at his enthusiasm as she flipped another batch of breakfast pancakes. "Not yet, sweetie. We've got 2 hours to get everything perfect." Together, they went through their final checklist. The bounce house company arrived right on schedule at 11 a.m., and the workers were kind enough to help arrange the other party equipment while they were there. One of them even showed her son how the bounce house's safety features worked, making him feel like he was part of the setup crew. The backyard transformed into a kid's paradise. Besides the bounce house, there were activity stations spread across the lawn. A craft table sat in the shade of their old oak tree, stocked with supplies for making friendship bracelets. Near the fence, they set up a science experiment station, her son's special request, with safe, fun experiments like making slime and watching baking soda volcanoes erupt. As they worked, Mrs. Jackson noticed her next-door neighbor, Mrs. Miller, peering through her window again. This time, she was talking on her phone while pointing at the party setup. Mrs. Jackson felt a knot form in her stomach, but pushed the worry aside. She'd done everything by the book. Gotten permits, informed the neighbors, even checked the local noise ordinances to make sure their celebration would stay within guidelines. The first guests arrived just before 2 p.m. A mom from the PTA brought her twins, who immediately ran to hug their friend. "This looks amazing," the mom said, looking around the yard in appreciation. "You've thought of everything." Her genuine warmth helped ease some of Mrs. Jackson's anxiety. More families started arriving, and soon the backyard was filled with the sound of children laughing and playing. Parents who'd planned to just drop off their kids ended up staying, drawn in by the welcoming atmosphere and the comfortable seating area Mrs. Jackson had created on the patio. They shared stories about their kids, traded recipes, and started planning future playdates. One of the most touching moments came when Tommy arrived with his mom. He was the boy from Science Club who had never been to a party before because of his autism. Mrs. Jackson's son immediately ran to greet him, showing him the science station first since he knew Tommy loved experiments. Tommy's mom had tears in her eyes as she watched her son join in with the other kids, included and accepted without hesitation. The children moved between activities like a happy swarm of bees. They took turns in the bounce house, following the safety rules without complaint. At the craft table, kids who barely knew each other worked together to create colorful bracelets. The science station became a hub of excitement every time a volcano erupted, with children cheering and asking to do it again. Mrs. Jackson worked tirelessly to keep everything running smoothly, but she wasn't alone. Other parents pitched in without being asked, helping to refill snack bowls, watching the bounce house line, and making sure every child felt included. It was turning into more than just a birthday party, it was becoming a true community gathering. Even some of the neighbors who hadn't RSVP'd stopped by with cards and well wishes. The family from across the street brought over extra ice when they noticed supplies running low. The elderly couple from 2 houses down came to watch the children play, sharing stories about their own grandkids' parties from years ago. The food was a hit, especially the allergen-free cupcakes that Mrs. Jackson had specially ordered so that every child could enjoy them. When it was time to sing Happy Birthday, the sound of 24 voices filled the air, slightly off-key but full of joy. Her son's face glowed as he made his wish and blew out the candles, surrounded by friends who genuinely cared about him. Throughout the afternoon, Mrs. Miller's curtains kept twitching, and occasionally she'd appear in her yard with her phone, seemingly documenting the party. Some of the other parents noticed and exchanged concerned glances, but the children were too busy having fun to pay any attention to the neighbors' strange behavior. A particularly heartwarming moment came when one of the quieter kids from class finally got up the courage to join in the games. The other children immediately welcomed him, showing him how to make the perfect slime and cheering when he succeeded. His mother later pulled Mrs. Jackson aside, tears in her eyes, saying this was the first time she'd seen her son really connect with his classmates. As the party reached its peak, the backyard was a symphony of joy. Children shouting in delight from the bounce house, others gathered around the science table watching experiments fizz and pop, and smaller groups sprawled on picnic blankets trading stickers and sharing stories. Parents chatted in comfortable clusters, many meeting properly for the first time despite their children being classmates all year. No one could have guessed that this beautiful scene of community and celebration was about to face an unexpected challenge. Mrs. Miller was making another phone call, her expression stern as she paced by her window, but for now, the party continued in its perfect rhythm of childhood happiness and parental pride. Around 3 o'clock, while the party was in full swing, Mrs. Miller's behavior began to escalate from suspicious watching to active interference. She emerged from her house with her phone pressed to her ear, walking along the property line while speaking loudly enough for nearby parents to hear. "Yes, I'm calling about a disturbance in our neighborhood," she said into the phone, pacing back and forth. "There's an extremely loud gathering next door. I'm concerned about the number of people. Yes, I can hold." One of the dads, a local teacher, overheard and checked the music volume on his phone. "It's well within the ordinance limits," he said quietly to another parent. "My app shows it's just 65 decibels. That's like normal conversation level." Mrs. Jackson was helping a group of kids with their science experiments when she noticed several parents exchanging worried glances. Following their gaze, she saw Mrs. Miller taking photos and videos of the children. A protective instinct surged through her. While the party was completely legal, photographing other people's children without permission certainly wasn't. 2 moms immediately moved to stand between the kids and Mrs. Miller's camera, while another parent quickly gathered the children closer to the house. The adults formed an instinctive barrier, protecting the young ones from feeling watched or uncomfortable. The kids, thankfully, remained absorbed in their activities, unaware of the tension building around them. "I need to report suspicious activity," Mrs. Miller's voice carried across the yard as she made another call. "There are people who don't live in this neighborhood coming and going. Yes, that's right. They're being very loud and disruptive." She emphasized certain words in a way that made her implications clear to everyone within earshot. The parents at the party, a diverse group from various backgrounds, exchanged knowing looks. They'd all experienced or witnessed this type of behavior before. But instead of letting it ruin the celebration, they drew closer together, their solidarity strengthening. One mother, a lawyer by profession, quietly stepped away to document everything Mrs. Miller was doing, including her attempts to photograph the children. Another parent, who served on the neighborhood council, started recording Mrs. Miller's behavior on his own phone, making sure to capture only her actions and none of the children. Mrs. Jackson felt her hands trembling slightly as she continued helping with the science experiments, trying to maintain a calm exterior for the kids. A warm hand touched her shoulder. It was Tommy's mom. "We're all here with you," she whispered. "Don't let her spoil this beautiful day." The children continued playing, their laughter a stark contrast to the undercurrent of tension among the adults. They were in the middle of a particularly exciting volcano experiment when Mrs. Miller's voice rose again. "Yes, police dispatcher. I want to report a public disturbance. These people are destroying the peace of our neighborhood." Several parents were now filming Mrs. Miller's behavior, while others documented the actual noise levels and party activities. The community had come together not just for a celebration, but to stand against discrimination. "I don't feel safe," Mrs. Miller continued her call, though she was the one making others uncomfortable. "There are too many of them, and they're playing loud music. This used to be a quiet neighborhood before these people moved in." A grandfather who'd come with his grandchild spoke up, his voice carrying clearly across the yard. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 40 years, and I've never seen a more well-organized children's party. The only disturbance here is coming from next door." Mrs. Miller's face reddened at his words, but she continued her call. "Yes, send someone quickly. I don't know what these people might do." She emphasized these people in a way that made her prejudice obvious to everyone present. Parents began quietly documenting everything: the actual volume levels, the proper permits posted by the bounce house, the respectful behavior of everyone at the party. Some took photos of their children happily playing, showing the true nature of the gathering. Others made notes of Mrs. Miller's exact words and actions. Mrs. Jackson's son, still unaware of the situation, ran up to show her the friendship bracelet he'd made. The sight of his joyful face helped her stay strong. This was his special day, and she was determined not to let anyone's prejudice overshadow it. Another neighbor, who hadn't been invited but had been watching from their house, walked over with a plate of cookies. "I hope it's okay to join," she said warmly. "I couldn't help but notice what a lovely party this is." Her small act of kindness brought tears to Mrs. Jackson's eyes. As police sirens became audible in the distance, the parents formed an even tighter community. They had nothing to hide. This was a children's birthday party with proper permits, reasonable noise levels, and responsible adult supervision. Mrs. Miller's claims would soon be exposed for what they really were. The tension in the air was thick, but the children's laughter continued to ring out, a reminder of why everyone was there in the first place. As the police cars approached, Mrs. Miller stood smugly by her fence, clearly expecting the officers to shut down the party. She had no idea that her actions were about to backfire in a way she never expected. 2 police cars pulled up to the curb, their lights off. Mrs. Miller hurried to meet them, gesturing dramatically toward the party. But before she could speak, one of the officers broke into a warm smile. "Hey, Mrs. Jackson," he called out, waving as he walked past an increasingly confused Mrs. Miller. Officer Wilson, the one who had called out, had worked with Mrs. Jackson at the youth center's weekend programs. Just last month, she'd helped organize a successful community outreach event that brought local kids and police officers together for a day of activities and conversation. His partner, Officer Rodriguez, followed close behind, taking in the scene with experienced eyes. The party was clearly well organized, with proper supervision and safety measures in place. The music was at a reasonable volume, and the children were having fun within appropriate boundaries. "We got a call about a disturbance," Officer Wilson said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "But all I'm seeing is a fantastic birthday party. Those science experiments look pretty exciting." He pointed to the volcano station, where a small group of kids watched in awe as another eruption fizzed and bubbled. Mrs. Miller pushed forward, her face flushed. "But officer, look at all these people. The noise, the chaos." She thrust her phone forward, showing photos she'd taken of the party. Officer Rodriguez took one look at the photos and frowned. "Ma'am, did you get permission from the parents to photograph their children? That could be a serious privacy concern." Mrs. Miller's face paled as she quickly lowered her phone. Meanwhile, several parents had approached with documentation in hand: the party permits, noise ordinance readings, and video evidence of Mrs. Miller's behavior. The lawyer mom stepped forward, introducing herself professionally. "We've documented everything," she said quietly to the officers, including several discriminatory comments and unauthorized photography of minors. Officer Wilson nodded, taking notes, but his attention was drawn to the children. Mrs. Jackson's son was showing his friends how to make elephant toothpaste. His face lit up with excitement as the foam erupted from the bottle. The officer smiled, remembering how this same kid had helped younger children with science projects at the youth center. "You know what this party needs?" Officer Rodriguez said suddenly, pulling out his phone. "I know someone who could make it even better." He stepped away to make a quick call, winking at his partner. Mrs. Miller, still hovering nearby, couldn't believe what she was seeing. But the noise complaints. The disruption to the neighborhood. Officer Wilson pulled out a decibel meter from his belt. "Let's check those noise levels, shall we?" He walked around the yard, taking readings at various points. "Well, would you look at that? Everything's well within legal limits. In fact, I've heard louder birds in the morning." Some of the parents chuckled, the tension beginning to ease. A few neighbors who had heard the commotion came out to see what was happening. Instead of complaining, they joined the growing circle of support. "I've lived here 30 years, said an elderly woman from across the street, "and I haven't seen such a well-behaved group of children in ages. They're having good, clean fun. Isn't that what we want in our neighborhood?" About 15 minutes later, another police car pulled up. This time, it was Officer Chen with his canine partner, a friendly German shepherd named Bear. The children's eyes went wide with excitement as Bear, wearing his official police vest, trotted into the backyard. "I heard there was a birthday party," Officer Chen announced, smiling. "Bear here loves parties, and he knows some pretty cool tricks. Would anyone like to see?" The response was immediate and enthusiastic. Children gathered around, their earlier activities temporarily forgotten in their excitement to meet the police dog. Even the more timid kids were drawn in by Bear's gentle demeanor. Mrs. Miller stood frozen, watching as the situation slipped further and further from her control. This was not how she had expected things to go. Instead of shutting down the party, the police were becoming part of the celebration. Officer Rodriguez approached her quietly. "Ma'am, we need to have a serious discussion about filing false reports and harassment, but we can do that down at the station another day. Right now, I suggest you return to your home and let these children enjoy their party." As Mrs. Miller stalked back to her house, Officer Wilson gathered the parents to explain their rights and options. "What happened here today wasn't right," he said firmly. "We take community relations very seriously, and there are proper channels to address this kind of behavior." The party had taken an unexpected turn, but somehow it had become even more special. Children were learning that police officers could be friends and allies. Parents were seeing their community come together against discrimination. Even some of the neighbors who had initially been distant were now joining in, bringing additional snacks and drinks to share. Officer Chen organized a demonstration with Bear, teaching the kids about police dogs and their important work. The children were fascinated, asking questions and listening attentively. Mrs. Jackson's son got to help with one of the demonstrations, beaming with pride as Bear followed his commands. As the afternoon continued, more neighbors dropped by, drawn by the positive atmosphere and the sight of police officers playing with children. What had started as a birthday party was transforming into something bigger, a true celebration of community, diversity, and standing up for what's right. The party's unexpected turn of events sparked changes that rippled through the entire neighborhood in the weeks and months that followed. What began as one neighbor's attempt to disrupt a child's birthday celebration transformed into a powerful catalyst for community growth and understanding. The very next day, several neighbors stopped by Mrs. Jackson's house with cards and small gifts for her son. The elderly couple who had defended the party brought over a telescope, explaining that they'd noticed his interest in science. "We've had this in our attic for years," they said. We think you'll make better use of it than we ever did." Word of what happened spread quickly through the community. The local neighborhood council called an emergency meeting to address the incident. Mrs. Miller was required to attend, along with other residents. Rather than turning into a confrontational event, the meeting became a thoughtful discussion about inclusion and community values. A mother who attended the party, who happened to be a diversity education specialist, offered to lead workshops for the neighborhood. "We all have biases," she explained gently. "The important thing is recognizing them and learning to do better." To everyone's surprise, several of the older residents who had previously kept to themselves were the first to sign up. The police department saw an opportunity too. Officer Wilson proposed making the youth center programs more regular, creating spaces where children and families from different backgrounds could interact naturally. Sometimes, he said during a community meeting, all it takes is seeing each other as people rather than strangers. Mrs. Miller's initial resistance to change began to soften after she was required to attend these community programs. Sitting in sessions alongside families she had once viewed with suspicion, hearing their stories, and watching their children play together, something shifted in her perspective. It wasn't an overnight transformation, but small changes became noticeable. One Tuesday morning, about a month after the party, Mrs. Miller was working in her garden when she saw Mrs. Jackson's son getting ready for school. The boy had paused to examine something on one of her rose bushes. Instead of rushing to assumptions, she found herself curious. "Would you like to see something interesting?" she called out, her voice tentative but genuine. The boy approached cautiously. Mrs. Miller showed him the chrysalis hanging from her rose bush, explaining how it would soon become a butterfly. His eyes lit up with scientific curiosity, asking questions that showed his bright mind. That brief interaction became a turning point in their relationship. The following weekend, Mrs. Miller attended a community gardening event organized by the neighborhood council. She brought cuttings from her prize roses to share, teaching other families how to grow them. Working alongside neighbors she had once avoided, she discovered connections she never expected to find. The police department's community relations program flourished. Officer Chen and Bear became regular visitors to the neighborhood, leading to the creation of a junior police science program that combined law enforcement education with hands-on experiments. Mrs. Jackson's son was one of the first to sign up, and his enthusiasm inspired many others to join. As summer approached, the neighborhood council proposed something unprecedented, a monthly community celebration that would rotate through different families' yards. The idea came from seeing how the birthday party had brought people together despite initial tensions. Parents who had attended the birthday party took leading roles in organizing these gatherings. They made sure each event included educational elements, cultural sharing, and plenty of activities for the children. The science station that had been such a hit at the birthday party became a regular feature, with different families contributing experiments and demonstrations. Mrs. Jackson's son's interest in science continued to grow. When he entered his project about community unity through shared learning in the school science fair, he won first place. His display included data from the neighborhood gatherings, showing how interaction and understanding had increased over time. The most touching moment came during the first community-wide celebration. Mrs. Miller, who had been quietly participating in various programs, approached Mrs. Jackson with tears in her eyes. "I was wrong," she said simply. "Thank you for showing me a better way." The two women didn't become best friends overnight, but they developed a respectful relationship based on their shared commitment to the community. The local newspaper ran a story about the neighborhood's transformation, highlighting how one incident led to positive change. Other communities began reaching out, asking for advice on starting their own unity programs. The police department's community relations model was adopted by other precincts, showing how law enforcement could help bridge divides rather than deepen them. As the one-year anniversary of the birthday party approached, the neighborhood council organized a special celebration. They called it the Unity in Community Festival, featuring food from different cultures, science demonstrations, police canine shows, and activities for all ages. The permit application was signed by every household in the neighborhood, including Mrs. Miller. Looking around at the festival, Mrs. Jackson's son tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Mom," he said thoughtfully, "remember when you said parties are for bringing people together? I think my birthday brought the whole neighborhood together." Mrs. Jackson hugged her son close, watching as children played, adults chatted, and Officer Chen demonstrated police dog training. The neighborhood had transformed from a place of quiet suspicion to one of active inclusion and understanding. Sometimes, she realized, the most powerful changes start with a simple birthday party and the courage to stand up for what's right.